I'm now going to introduce you to the next step that comes after the modeling process, and that's the UV mapping process. We're not going to cover the UV mapping tools in this module. We'll cover that in the next one. But this module is to introduce you to the concept of what UVs are. I'm also going to show you how to apply a material to an object and then apply a texture to that material, just to get you in the habit of going through these steps so that you can understand everything that's going to be coming after this. So to begin with, I'm going to create a primitive. So I've created a cube. And to see the UV map, what I can do is I come up to Windows, Modeling Editors, UV Editor. Now what this UV map is it's the 2D representation of this 3D model. So if you notice, in the model we've worked with vertex, edge, and face as components. So vertex is the point. Now that correlates also to UVs. The UV is the individual point that the vertex is made of. So in this case, there are three faces that are connecting with this vertex right here at this corner, which means there are actually three separate UVs that are being used here. So there's the one for this face, the one for this face, which currently they're being shared, and the one down here. And each primitive has its default UV layout. I want to talk very quickly about the 0 to 1 space because that's a term that's going to start coming up. When we're looking at UVs, just as with any grid, there is position. So 0 to 1 to create this cube. And beyond that, it's 1 to 2 and so forth. And this way it's negative. So 0 to negative 1. Same thing here, 0 to 1 and 0 to negative 1. So when I say the 0 to 1 space on the grid, it means the space within this particular square. So between 0 and 1, and both positive. So there's some things that I'm going to point out right now. With this cube, if I decide to increase the subdivision, so I change that to 5, 5, 5, it can add those subdivisions within this same UV space from this default layout. So I can take those back to 1. And for right now, I'm going to move this to the side, and I will create another primitive. So this time I'll pull up a cylinder. Move that to the side, and a sphere. And scale that up. And so you can see as I select each one of these objects, each of them has their own default UV layout. Now the way this becomes practical is when we start creating and applying materials. By default, as we've talked about before, there is a Lambert 1 attached, or in the case of Unity Light, or excuse me, Maya Light, it's a, I'm trying to remember, either a Blinn or a Phong one, but it's a default material, and we want to get away from using default materials. They don't play well in most game engines or rendering engines, and so you really do want to have custom materials and custom textures for each of the objects. In order to create a material, I can come to Windows, Rendering Editors, Hypershade. In the Hypershade, I can come down here to Create, and I can look for a different material. I can create another Lambert, and in this case I'll just do 3 Lamberts. But Lamberts are limited in that they don't have a specular map, so you may need to do a Blinn or a Phong if you're going to do specular maps later on. But for right now, Lamberts work. And so I can select this Lambert 2, and I will call this cube_matte. Lambert 3, I will do cylinder_matte. Lambert 4, I will do sphere_matte. And _matte is my way of naming things so that I can have the same name between different objects so that I know where they connect. You can name it whatever you want, but I recommend coming up with some kind of naming structure to make life easier for yourself. Since I've got these 3 new materials, what I can do is I can select each of these objects, and I'll actually name them right here as I go. So this will be cube_mesh. Sphere_mesh, and cylinder_mesh. So that creates the objects and making sure that they're named. But with the cube selected, I can come down to Cube Matte, hold down the right mouse key, and go Assign Material to Selection. And there's no obvious visual change, but as you can see here on the tabs, instead of having what's over here with the initial shading group and Lambert 1, now it is strictly the cube mesh shape. There's the polycube information, which when we delete the history, that'll go away, and then the cube matte, which is our new information. So for the sphere, I'll do the same thing. So assign the sphere there. And for the cylinder, same thing. So each of them has their own unique material that's now applied. Once again, it's not doing a whole lot for me because you can't really tell the difference. But if I change the color, for example, make this like a red, you'll be able to see it a little bit easier, except it's not showing. The reason why, once again, there's the wireframe in 4, 5 for shaded, 6 for shaded and textured, and 7 for shaded, textured, and colored. And for some reason, it's still not updating with the color. So I'm not sure exactly what's going on, but hopefully we'll be able to resolve it in the next little bit, because that should be showing up. So that's okay. We'll move on for now, but that should show up. I'll switch it back to 5 so that I can show you how this works with the textures. So what I'm going to do first is I am going to open up this. This is some of the titles I'm using for these videos. So I will copy these and then open up this. Now this is the project folder. In the project folder, if I go to source images and I drop some images in there, so I will paste those 3 images, I can then use those and access them very quickly. You can actually find stuff anywhere, but it's easier if you've placed it within the project for ease of access. So for the cube matte, where it says color, if I come over here to the checker box and I left click on it, it will bring up Create Render Node. Now the node that I want to put in there is actually a file. I want to grab a file or a texture file and plug it into the color attribute to be able to put it on the material. So I select File, and that brings up this window, File 1. And here next to image name, there's a folder. So I will click on that. And once again, if my project is set, it should go straight to the source images, and I can grab this title 1.1 and hit Open. Now this should be in place. Once again, 4 is wireframe, 5 is texture or shaded, 6 is shaded and textured. And so now I have this texture that's applied to the material, which is applied to the mesh. So to see that, I can open up the UV editor, and you can see why things are where they are. So if I grab this face, you can see that that's where the top of it is. This face right here is for the development. And so if I want to start playing around with it, I can actually move things and scale it in and out. And that's how the UV mapping works. So think of it in terms of something like a soup can. If you were to take a Campbell's soup can, slice the label along one side and unfold it, how would that lay out in 2D? Well, that's exactly what you're doing. You're taking these 3D objects and slicing them and laying them out in a 2D space. So I'm going to step that back. I'm then going to move to the next object and its material. So for the cube matte, okay, let me switch to object mode, make sure I'm working correctly. Okay, so for the sphere matte, once again, under color, I select the checker box to create render node, select file, and I can select the folder. And this time I will grab title 1-2. And you can see that that's where it is, and I have it upside down. So let me get that straightened up. And so there we go. So 3D content development pipeline. I can then do the same thing for the third one. Select that checker box, file, the folder, and 1-3, and select open. And there we go. So now each of these has its own unique texture applied to the material, which is applied to the objects. And once again, I can make adjustments and changes. So if I go Window, Modeling Editor, UV Editor, I can grab something like these faces, and I can spread them out and move them up so that now that fits wonderfully across here. So I can see 3D content development pipeline. And so that's roughly the process for adding a material to an object and applying a texture to a material. From here on out, you're going to be able to use this skill set to, first off, learn to adjust UV editors. That's going to be what we cover in the next module, is how to actually make use of this. Yes, these default UV layouts are okay for these default objects, but they're not always necessarily the best or the most efficient. And especially if you get complex objects that you've modeled, you need to figure out how to lay out your UVs in a way that it works efficiently, that it works effectively, that there's not overlap, that it works clean, and that you can create a texture or 2D texture that will be accurately represented on your object with the UVs laid out. So we're going to move to there, and from there you will learn about texture creation, so that you can start creating your own custom textures to fit within your custom UV layouts for the objects that you're modeling. So for right now, play around with the primitives and go through the process of adding materials, adding textures to those materials, and just getting used to the concept of unwrapping a 3D object on a 2D space.